where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God help us.
Hello, welcome to This World. Vladimir Amelyan joins us from Kiev, and he is currently on the front line fighting Russian troops.
We believe that the world should be ruled by democracies.
I was interviewing you on television a couple of weeks back.
That's right.
And you said, if you really want to understand Jerusalem, why don't you come here and see it?
Hi everyone, welcome to WION Live Broadcast from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani. First, let's get you up to speed with this hour's latest headlines. India removes additional duties on several U.S. products ahead of President Joe Biden's visit to New Delhi for bilateral talks and the G20 summit. The levy had been imposed in 2019 in a tit-for-tat move. Moscow says that Washington's decision to supply depleted Iranian ammunition to Ukraine is very bad news. Britain rejoins the Horizon Europe Science Research Program. The program will revive EU grants and funding for research projects. India's space agency releases images of the Earth and Moon taken by a camera on board its spacecraft days after it was launched to study the sun in its first such solar mission. Five-time World Player of the Year Cristiano Ronaldo says that his rivalry with Argentine World Cup winner Lionel Messi changed the history of football, but is now over. Well, it seems like the future of battlefield is here. We're talking about drones. These are being effectively used in the war in Ukraine, and now the Pentagon has announced a new initiative to use this technology. According to a Wall Street Journal report, the U.S. Department of Defense is considering the development of a vast network of artificial intelligence-powered technology, drones, and autonomous systems. These will be developed within the next 2 years to counter threats from China. The report added that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, will sketch out some of the air, land, and sea capabilities that the Pentagon is looking to develop. Last week as well, reports came about Pentagon's new initiative, which they dubbed as replicators. Pentagon intends to field thousands of drones within the next 2 years for possible conflicts in the Taiwan Strait. These low-cost and mass-deployed unmanned systems could put pressure on Beijing. And according to Hicks, replicator is meant to help U.S. overcome Beijing's biggest advantage, mass, which basically means more ships, more missiles, and more people. The Deputy Secretary of Defense further added that with the deployment of these drones, it will become difficult for Beijing to attack them. It will be harder to hit and harder to beat. Funding for Replicator would come from existing funds and costs hundreds of millions. The latest Pentagon budget request includes $1.8 billion for artificial intelligence for fiscal year 2024.
We can do that.
That'd be awesome again.
Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani has stated that partnership with China is more important than a deal like the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement comes as a blow to China as it attempts to reignite its economy post-COVID. The Italian foreign minister's statements came after a visit to Beijing earlier this week. China's Belt and Road Initiative, often referred to as the New Silk Road, was launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013. It consists of massive investments in infrastructure like ports, railways, and airports. The initiative is aimed at improving trade ties between Asia, Africa, and Europe. However, critics viewed this as a means to increase Beijing's influence. Back in 2019, Italy became the first major Western nation and the only nation from the G7 club of industrialized countries to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. According to Tajani, the deal with China has failed to meet Italian expectations. The country has repeatedly hinted that it would withdraw from the deal. The deal is to be renewed automatically in March of 2024 unless Italy withdraws this year. And it does not seem like Rome is in any mood to renew the deal. Earlier in July, Italy's defense minister also criticized the failure of the initiative to deliver results. He said, quote, "The choice to join the Silk Road was an improvised and wicked act." He further added that, quote, "We exported a load of oranges to China. They tripled exports to Italy in 3 years." Meanwhile, China seems to be saying otherwise. Take a listen.
The cooperation between China and Italy under the Belt and Road Initiative has yielded fruitful results. In the past 5 years, the trade volume between the two countries has increased from $50 billion to nearly $80 billion. With Italy's exports to China increasing by about 30%. Relying on the platforms such as the China International Import Expo in Shanghai and the China International Consumer Products Expo in Hainan, all kinds of Italian quality products have entered tens of thousands of Chinese households.
The possible termination of the old Silk Road deal will be a diplomatic disaster for China, which expects to mark the achievement of the Belt and Road Initiative at an international forum in Beijing in October. China has now stated that 90 countries have confirmed attendance for the conference. All right. Well, for more on this, our correspondent Giles Gibson from Rome has sent us this report. Take a look.
Well, we heard some of the reasons why Italy could pull out of its agreement with China in terms of the BRI from Antonio Tajani, the foreign minister, as he gave Parliament an update about his recent trip just a few days ago to have talks with Chinese officials in Beijing. He said that the BRI had been, quote, unsatisfactory when it came to exports from Italy to China and also inward investment into Italy. He also said that strategic partnership with China would be preferable instead of single bilateral deals. We've also been hearing from the Chinese Commerce Ministry over the course of the last few hours in the wake of that trip from the Italian Foreign Minister, saying that China is willing to work with Italy to deepen mutually beneficial cooperation and explore opportunities for potential trade and investment.
Trouble is mounting for U.S. President Joe Biden. Prosecutors say that they will seek his son Hunter Biden's indictment by September 29th in the tax and firearms case. Special Counsel David Wise said in a court filing that the government would seek a grand jury indictment before the September 29th deadline under the Speedy Trial Act. Back in July, a U.S. district judge rejected a proposed plea deal that would have resolved the tax and gun charges, raising concerns over the legality and the scope of immunity it offered to Hunter Biden. Meanwhile, Hunter Biden's lawyers have blamed the prosecutors for backtracking on the plea deal, thus raising the possibility of a criminal trial ahead of the presidential elections scheduled for next year. Hunter Biden's attorney, Abby Lowell, expressed his belief on Wednesday that the deal was still in effect. He added that Hunter Biden's side expects a fair resolution in the 5-year investigation into his client. Lowell further underlined that the case was not outside political pressure. Under the proposed plea agreement, Hunter Biden would have pleaded guilty to evading paying $1.5 million in income between 2017 and 18. He would have also entered into a separate deferred prosecution agreement for illegally owning a firearm while using drugs, which is a felony under U.S. law. However, the prosecutors are yet to substantiate any allegations around Hunter having committed any corruption using his influence. Naturally, the case has become a political lightning rod. Republicans have raised the possibility of impeaching President Biden in Congress over his son's business dealings and possible ties to himself as well. They also accused the Department of Justice of giving him a sweetheart deal. However, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland has denied accusations of favoritism. The stage is set for the G20 summit in the Indian capital as global leaders start to arrive in New Delhi soon. U.S. President Joe Biden will also be there. So what is on the agenda for the summit? Well, President Biden faces polls next year. How will this summit impact the voters back at home? And will he be able to use this platform to his favor before the elections? Take a look at our next report.
India, the current president of the G20, will host global leaders for the summit scheduled between September 9th and 10th in New Delhi. US President Joe Biden will also be arriving in the Indian national capital on September 7th for this year's Group of 20 Leaders Summit. But the American president is not the only going to attend the summit. After arriving in India, the US President will first be holding a bilateral meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Discussions will likely focus on implementing agreements reached during Prime Minister Modi's state visit to the US in the month of June. Meanwhile, at the summit, both the leaders, US President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with the rest of the leaders, will discuss the capacity of multilateral development banks, including the World Bank. To better fight poverty, they will also address the global challenges. And once again, the ongoing war in Russia-Ukraine will take the center stage. The leaders will mitigate the economic and social impacts of the war. While we discuss this, how will it affect things for Biden back at home? The US is scheduled to host its presidential elections next year, but his latest approval ratings paint a grim picture. The American president's rating stands at 40.5%, while his Republican contender, who is most likely to challenge him for the White House, Donald Trump, is leading the polls in the GOP race. Now, despite Trump facing 91 criminal charges across 4 cases, as of now, things don't look too well for Biden. Questions are being asked about his age. Biden is already the oldest person to hold the job. He will turn 81 this November. The American president also has a series of slip-ups and gaffes. Amidst this, the G20 summit comes as an opportunity for Biden to show America's leadership at the world stage. While this may not affect average American voters directly, but how he conducts himself in front of the world leaders might help him woo Americans when he contests for the White House for a second term. Just a few days ago, US President Joe Biden expressed disappointment over Chinese President Xi Jinping's absence from the summit. This attracted criticism from the Republicans. Earlier, they had also slammed Biden for pursuing what they call fruitless engagement with China, participating in talks with Beijing on their terms and timelines and conditions set by Beijing. Moreover, in India, a joint communique might not be on the cards. US would still push for Ukraine's cause. Americans, however, have different opinions on support for Ukraine. According to a poll, most Americans oppose Congress authorizing additional funding to support Ukraine. 55% say that Congress should not authorize additional funding, while 45% believe that US should provide aid to Ukraine. 71% of Republicans broadly say that Congress should not authorize new funding to Ukraine. while among Democrats, 62% favor sending additional funds to Ukraine.
The Biden administration has faced a slew of domestic and international challenges, leading to a huge dip in polls. The White House now hopes that the G20 summit is an opportunity for the president to showcase his ability to deal with complex international issues while reasserting America's role on the global stage. Also, they hope that G20 is an opportunity for President Biden to demonstrate his leadership skills with the November elections looming and challenge the notion that age plays a huge factor in his re-election. Well, a lot has changed since 2008 when the first G20 summit was held here in the United States. New opportunities, new challenges, and new threats have emerged in the last 2 decades. Our next report looks at how the economic tapestry of the world has changed since the first G20 summit. Take a look.
The world was a very different place in 2008. The US was still the only dominant superpower in the world. Europe still punched much above its weight, and China was emerging as a contender to be a superpower. India, the host this year, was an emerging economy and was not even in the top 10 in economic terms. Take these numbers for some context. In 2008, the US was the undisputed world number 1 economy. Japan was the second biggest economy by a huge margin. Several European countries completed the top 10 list. China was the 6th biggest economy and India was in the 12th position. The world economy was essentially tilted towards the West. So what changed in these 15 years? The 2008-10 economic crisis hastened the decline of the US-led West. That shifted the economic dynamics for the first time since the Second World War. It heralded the Asian century, primarily led by India and China. Fast forward to 2023. The US is still the world's biggest economy and by extension a superpower. But the country is now a pale shadow of its former self, with China fast catching up with it. Once equal to the US economy, the European Union is now about half the size of the US GDP. Japan continues to stagnate, while countries like the UK and France have economically declined. China is now the second biggest economy in the world, while India is the 5th. A recent IMF report suggests that China and India will drive half of 2023's economic growth. To add to it, India is likely to remain the fastest growing major economy in the world. The world is worried about China's economy, which is a major driver of global trade and commerce. On the other hand, India is increasingly becoming the voice of the developing world. The country is pushing for a new economic order, with the wind blowing eastwards in the G20. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Ahead of the G20 summit and U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to India, America's National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, John Kirby, has said that the U.S. can't stop India from buying Russian oil. Kirby said every sovereign country, including India, has the right to buy oil or lubricants from any other country. These remarks came upon the query being asked whether India buying oil from Russia could be on the agenda of President Biden's discussion with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi during bilateral talks on Friday. Responding to that question, Kirby said that the U.S. has encouraged all nations to purchase oil in accordance with the price cap, but does not believe that this is a time for business with Vladimir Putin and Russia. He further added that every nation has to make their own sovereign decisions. Bruce Springsteen has canceled all remaining dates of his touring calendar for the month of September. The 73-year-old rock singer is suffering from peptic ulcer disease and has been advised by doctors to take the rest of the month off for treatment. Peptic ulcers are open sores that develop on the inside of the stomach lining and the upper portion of the small intestine, with most common symptoms being stomach pain. Springsteen has promised to reschedule the canceled performances, beginning with a show for this week in New York, as well as a previously missed date in Philadelphia a few weeks earlier. Ticket holders for the postponed concerts were told that they would receive information regarding rescheduled dates. The other postponed dates were September 9th in Baltimore, September 12th and 14th in Pittsburgh, and September 19th here in New York. Carlos Alcaraz is 2 wins away from becoming the first man since Roger Federer in 2008 to defend his U.S. Open title. The top seed overcame Olympic champion Alexander Zverev in straight sets to book a blockbuster semifinal clash with 2021 winner Daniil Medvedev. 2020 U.S.